It was a quiet evening in Springfield, Ohio. J.D. Vance, tired from a long day of meetings and discussions, pulled his car into the parking lot of Owen's Diner. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. A small weathered building with a neon sign that flickered in the early evening light. The diner sat at the corner of a sleepy street, nestled between a couple of old shops that looked like they had seen better days. But there was something comforting about it, something that seemed to invite you to stop and take a break from the world. J.D. had heard about Owen's Diner from a local earlier that day. The man had raved about the place, especially the homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. J.D. wasn't the kind of person who cared much for food at the best of times, but after hours of speaking with politicians, shaking hands, and sitting through countless policy discussions, all he wanted now was a simple meal and a few minutes of peace before heading back home. He parked his car, the engine giving a soft cough as he turned it off. For a moment, he sat there, staring at the diner. The neon sign buzzed quietly, casting a flickering light over the cracked pavement. The air smelled of grilled burgers, fresh coffee, and something else. Something familiar, like the kind of place where people came for comfort, not just food. J.D. opened the door of his car and stepped out. The cool evening air hit his face, and for the first time that day, he felt the weight of exhaustion in his shoulders. He stretched his arms above his head, taking a deep breath as he made his way to the diner's entrance. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The moment he entered, he was met with the familiar sounds of a diner, the low hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the soft sizzling sound of food being prepared in the kitchen. It wasn't a big place, but it felt like it had been here for ages. The walls were lined with old photos of past customers and staff, faded Polaroids pinned up near the register. It had that cozy, worn-in feel that told you this was a place where people came back again and again. The hostess behind the counter looked up as J.D. walked in. She was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her smile was warm, but when her eyes met J.D.'s, something shifted. It was quick, barely a second, but J.D. noticed. Her smile faltered just enough for him to catch the change. It wasn't a look of recognition, but something more subtle, something he couldn't quite place. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft and friendly. "Dining in or taking out?" J.D. hesitated for a moment, surprised by the slight hesitation in her voice, but he smiled and replied, "Dining in, if that's all right." The hostess glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen. J.D. could see her eyes flicker, as if she was checking something, though there was nothing out of the ordinary about the situation. She turned back to him, her smile returning, though it seemed a bit forced this time. "I'll just check something real quick," she said, a little too quickly. "Just one moment." J.D. stood there, waiting. It wasn't like he'd never seen a diner get busy, or a hostess checking on things behind the scenes, but something about the way she'd stepped away made him uneasy. The air felt different now, heavier. J.D. glanced around the room. A few heads turned as he entered, which wasn't unusual in a small diner, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man sitting at the counter halfway through his burger leaned in and whispered something to the person beside him. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too hard, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly before she quickly looked away. J.D. tried to shrug off the feeling. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just tired. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands sliding into his jacket pockets. He took a deep breath, trying to relax. After all, he wasn't looking for any trouble. He was just here for a simple meal. The seconds stretched on as he stood there, waiting. Behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell. The conversation was too indistinct for him to make out, but he could hear the tension in the silence. The hostess had been gone longer than usual. J.D. exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, trying to shake the unease that had started to settle over him. A few more customers glanced over at him, their eyes lingering longer than he was comfortable with. It was strange. He hadn't said anything yet. He hadn't even ordered. Still, it felt like he was being sized up, like everyone in the room was suddenly aware of him, even though he hadn't done anything to draw attention. The door to the kitchen swung open, and the hostess stepped back into view. She no longer looked uncertain, like she had when she first saw him. Now, her expression was firm, her lips pressed together as she stepped toward him. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice low but clear. "We can't serve you tonight." JD's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected this. There was no explanation, no apology, just the cold, direct words that hung in the air like a heavy weight. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. JD glanced around the room again. The regulars were still watching, their eyes now wide with curiosity. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others just stared at him, waiting for his next move. This wasn't what he had expected when he stepped into Owen's diner. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his gut. The room felt smaller now, the tension thick enough that even the clinking of silverware seemed to have stopped. J.D. Vance wasn't a man to make a scene, but this was different. He wasn't about to walk away quietly. Not now. The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, thick and choking. J.D. Vance stood there, frozen for a moment, as the hostess's words sank in. "We can't serve you tonight." He had expected a lot of things when he walked into Owen's diner. Maybe a few friendly smiles, a greasy spoon meal to fill the emptiness of his stomach, and some time to think before the long drive back. What he had not expected was to be turned away without explanation, and most certainly not in the cold, dismissive way he was being treated. The room fell into a heavy silence, so thick that even the sound of the sizzling grill from the kitchen seemed to fade away. The hostess stood a few feet away, her body tense, her lips still pressed together in that thin line. She didn't look sorry, didn't look apologetic at all. In fact, she looked almost determined. J.D. glanced around the diner once again. Every pair of eyes seemed to be on him now. The man at the counter who had whispered earlier wasn't whispering anymore. He was outright staring at J.D., his burger halfway to his mouth, but forgotten in the tension of the moment. The woman in flannel, the one who had set her coffee down too hard earlier, was watching intently now, her hand resting on the table, as if she was waiting for something. But it wasn't just the customers watching him. There was something more here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. J.D. had been in enough high-stakes rooms, had faced enough challenging moments to know when a situation was escalating. This was one of those moments. "Is there a problem?" J.D.'s voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, one that hadn't been there before. He wasn't the kind of person who got upset easily, but this felt wrong. The hostess shifted uncomfortably on her feet. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, J.D. thought maybe she hadn't heard him. But then, without breaking eye contact, she spoke again, her voice even firmer this time. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, "but we can't serve you tonight. It's just the way it is." Her words were final, and there was no room for negotiation. J.D.'s mind raced. What was going on here? Was this some kind of mistake? Or was there something more beneath the surface that he wasn't seeing? He glanced over at the other customers again. Their eyes were still locked on him, some of them whispering to one another now, though the words were too soft to hear clearly. One man, an older fellow with a thick gray beard, muttered something under his breath and shook his head. It was the kind of shake that suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. J.D. could feel the room closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter with every second that passed. "Listen," J.D. said, his voice steady, but filled with an underlying tension. "If there's a problem, I'd like to understand it. I'm just here for a meal, nothing more. If there's some kind of mistake, let's clear it up." His words were calm, but there was a steeliness in them that made it clear he wasn't backing down. The hostess didn't immediately respond. Instead, she glanced back toward the kitchen, where the muffled voices had started to rise again. J.D. could see the silhouettes of a few figures moving behind the frosted glass of the kitchen door. The tension in the room was palpable now. Every set of eyes trained on JD, waiting for his next move. A few seconds passed before the hostess spoke again, her voice dropping lower, as if she were speaking to him, and to everyone else at the same time. "You don't belong here," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. The words stung more than JD would have liked to admit. He stood there, his breath catching for a moment, trying to make sense of the hostility in the air. "I don't belong here," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What does that mean?" But before the hostess could respond, there was a sound from behind the kitchen door. It was a loud bang, like something being slammed down on the counter. The room went completely silent for a split second, the air thick with uncertainty. Then, as if to break the tension, the door to the kitchen swung open. A man in a stained apron appeared, his expression grim. He looked at JD, then at the hostess, then back at JD. The silence between them was deafening. The man didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stood there, watching JD with eyes that seemed to measure him, judging him, though JD couldn't tell for what. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "We don't serve your kind," the man said flatly, his words cutting through the quiet like a knife. His tone was cold, devoid of any trace of politeness or explanation. JD's heart raced, his jaw tightened as he processed the words. His kind. What the hell was going on here? He had been in enough places where people disagreed with his politics, where he wasn't always the most popular person in the room. But this was different. This was personal. The silence that followed was suffocating. JD looked around at the faces in the diner again. This time, he could see the fear in their eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear you'd expect in a place like this. It wasn't fear of him, or fear of the confrontation. No, it was the kind of fear that made them look like they were trapped in a situation they didn't know how to escape. The hostess and the man in the apron waited for JD's response, but he didn't know what to say. His mind raced, but his words wouldn't come. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, and JD felt it. The entire diner was holding its breath. The words the man had spoken echoed in JD's mind. "We don't serve your kind." It wasn't just a rejection. It felt like a statement loaded with something more. JD's gaze flickered from the man in the apron to the hostess, and back to the diners. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for his next move. But JD was frozen. The atmosphere was thick, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. The hostess didn't flinch. She stood there, her posture still rigid, her hands clasped together in front of her. The silence stretched out, stretching between JD and the people who were watching him. His thoughts raced, but no words came out. He had been in situations where people disagreed with him, where he had faced criticism or anger, but this was different. This was something else entirely. The man in the apron stepped forward, breaking the silence with another chilling statement. "You should leave before it gets worse." His voice was cold, empty of any sympathy. There was no room for negotiation, no sign of compromise. It was clear. JD was not wanted here. JD's eyes narrowed as he processed the situation. What did they mean? Why was this happening? His mind flashed back to the moments earlier, when the hostess had hesitated before asking him if he was dining in or taking out. And the looks, the way the other customers watched him, some whispering, some glaring. They weren't just random reactions. There was something brewing here, something JD didn't fully understand yet. Slowly, JD exhaled, his frustration bubbling under the surface, but he kept his cool. He wasn't one to make rash decisions. He was a man who preferred to think, to calculate. But the situation was getting tense, and JD had a feeling things were about to spiral beyond his control. "What's going on here?" JD asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. "I don't understand. Why am I being treated like this?" The man in the apron opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could say anything, another voice interrupted. It was the voice of the man who had been sitting at the counter earlier, the one who had whispered something to the person across from him. JD hadn't noticed him getting up, but now he stood behind him, his face filled with tension. "You really don't know, do you?" The man's voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was an edge to it. It was as though he wanted to share the truth but wasn't sure if JD was ready to hear it. JD turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the man. The air seemed to grow even heavier, thick with unspoken words. The man at the counter took a step closer, his voice still barely audible, but carrying an undeniable weight. "People like you don't belong here." He paused, his eyes flicking to the others in the diner. "This is our town. You've stirred up enough trouble. We don't want any more of it." JD's heart skipped a beat. He had been around enough to know when things were getting personal. He had faced protests, dealt with people who disagreed with him, but never like this. This wasn't just about politics. This wasn't even about a difference of opinion. This was something darker, something deeper. The man in the apron shook his head slowly, a grim smile curling at the corner of his lips. "I told you to leave. You should have listened." JD stood there, caught between anger and confusion, the weight of the situation settling in like a heavy stone. What had he walked into? What was going on in this small town that he didn't know about? He had heard whispers of discontent in the past, of divisions, but this felt like something bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. Without thinking, JD took a step back, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the words, the looks, the hostility in the air. It was then that he saw it, a subtle shift in the faces around him. The diners weren't just bystanders anymore. They were complicit. Their eyes told him everything he needed to know. They were waiting for him to make a choice. The tension was almost unbearable. JD could feel the weight of every pair of eyes, the air thick with the sense that something was about to happen, something he couldn't control. "Leave," the man in the apron repeated, his voice firm, cold, final. JD hesitated, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was up against, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to leave without answers. He couldn't walk away without understanding why this was happening. He had faced much worse in his career, and he wasn't about to let this small-town intimidation force him out. "Not until you explain what this is all about," JD said firmly. His voice was calm but resolute, cutting through the tension. There was a long pause. The man in the apron didn't respond right away, and for a brief moment, JD thought he might give in. But then, a slight movement caught JD's attention. The man's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, his face hardening. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. This was no longer a simple disagreement. This was about power, about control. "We've said all we need to say," the man replied, his voice cold, as if he had given JD all the information he was going to get. He turned his back on JD, walking away as if the matter was closed. JD stood there for a moment longer, his mind still processing the situation. This wasn't a diner. This wasn't a simple refusal of service. This was something personal, something far deeper than he could see. But he wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. He glanced around the room once more, meeting the eyes of the people who had been watching him closely. They all seemed to understand something he didn't, and that was the problem. JD's mind was racing, the situation more baffling and unsettling by the second. He could feel the eyes of the entire diner on him, their gazes heavy, calculating. He wasn't used to being the center of such attention, especially not in a place like this. The small-town diner, with its flickering neon sign and the familiar scent of burgers and fries, had suddenly become the last place he wanted to be. The man in the apron had turned away from him, leaving JD standing there with only the sound of murmured voices to keep him company. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to slice through. JD took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what had triggered this hostile reaction, but he wasn't going to stand there quietly and let it go. Not without answers. He scanned the room again, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the people around him. The man at the counter was now sitting back down, his eyes avoiding JD's, pretending as if nothing had happened. The woman in the flannel shirt was still sipping her coffee, but her gaze darted to JD's face every few seconds, as though she was waiting for something, anything to happen. And then there was the hostess, who had retreated into the kitchen. JD hadn't forgotten the look she had given him earlier, that fleeting hesitation before she had asked him what he wanted. It had been brief, but it was clear she knew something he didn't. Maybe she could give him the answers he needed. He took a deep breath and made his way toward the kitchen door. The bell above it jingled again, almost mockingly, as he pushed it open. The kitchen was a small, cramped space, filled with the smell of sizzling food and the clatter of pans. Behind the counter, a couple of cooks were working, their backs to him. The hostess was standing by the sink, washing dishes, her expression unreadable. JD approached her slowly, trying to keep his tone neutral. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he had to understand why he was being treated like this. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to understand what's going on here. Why did they tell me to leave? What did I do?" The hostess didn't immediately respond. She paused for a moment, her back still turned to him as she scrubbed a dish. JD could feel the tension between them, the silence thick and heavy. Finally, she set the dish down and turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You didn't do anything," she said softly, "but you're not welcome here." Her words stung, but JD wasn't about to back down. "What does that mean? Why am I not welcome?" The hostess sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she had been carrying a heavy weight for too long. She glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was listening before she spoke again. "It's not about you," she said quietly. "It's about everything else. This town, it's changed. People here, they don't want outsiders. They don't want anything that challenges the way they've always lived. And you, JD Vance, you're a symbol of everything they're afraid of." JD blinked, taken aback by her words. He had expected a different answer, maybe something more personal or accusatory. But this was a whole new level of hostility. He had always been a figure of change, someone who pushed boundaries, but he had never experienced anything like this before. "So, this isn't just about me?" JD asked, his voice low. "This is about something bigger." The hostess nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and fear. "People here, they don't trust anyone who stands for something they don't understand. They don't want progress. They don't want change. And you're the face of everything they fear. You're not just a politician to them, JD. You're a threat." JD felt the weight of her words settle heavily in his chest. He had always prided himself on standing for something greater than himself, on fighting for what he believed was right. But in this town, it seemed his ideals had made him the enemy. A dangerous enemy, one that no one wanted around. "I'm not a threat," JD said, his voice more forceful now. "I'm just trying to do my job, to help people. That's all." The hostess didn't seem convinced. She shook her head slowly. "You don't get it, do you? They don't care about that. They care about control. They care about keeping things the way they've always been. And anyone who tries to change that, they're not welcome." JD ran a hand through his hair, frustration building inside him. He had come to this town expecting a quiet meal, a brief respite from his busy day. But now he realized that there was more at play here than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just a diner. This wasn't just a town. This was a battle for something bigger, something he hadn't yet fully grasped. He looked at the hostess, trying to read her face, but she remained an enigma. She wasn't his enemy, but she wasn't his ally either. She was just caught in the middle. "So what am I supposed to do?" JD asked, his voice softer now, almost defeated. "Am I supposed to leave and never come back? Let them win?" The hostess didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just turned away, her back to him once again as she resumed her work. JD stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. He had expected some kind of resolution, some kind of closure, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. As JD turned to leave, his mind buzzing with a million thoughts, he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Whatever had started here, whatever was going on in this town, it was just beginning. And he wasn't about to walk away without uncovering the truth. JD left the kitchen, his thoughts swirling in confusion and frustration. The hostess's words echoed in his mind, a symbol of everything they're afraid of. But what did that really mean? Who exactly was afraid of him, and why? He didn't have all the answers, but there was something undeniable in the way the air in Owen's diner had thickened the moment he walked in. It wasn't just about the food, the small-town charm, or even the politics. No, this felt more personal. He walked back into the dining area, his eyes sweeping over the room once more. It was like something had shifted while he was in the back. The few people who had been watching him with subtle curiosity before now seemed to avoid eye contact, pretending to be engrossed in their meals or their conversations. But JD could feel it. The tension was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to break. As he stood near the door, unsure of what to do next, the man from the counter stood up, his eyes locked on JD. There was something familiar about the way he moved, slow, deliberate. JD instinctively braced himself for another confrontation, his hand tightening into a fist by his side. The man took a step toward him, his face unreadable. JD watched him approach, every second feeling like it was drawn out, each footstep more deliberate than the last. "Are you just going to stand there, or are you going to leave?" the man asked, his voice low, almost like a challenge. There was an edge to his tone, something sharp that made JD's stomach tighten. JD's heart pounded. He had already been humiliated once tonight, but this wasn't just about pride anymore. Something deeper was at play. And JD wasn't about to back down now. He couldn't. He wouldn't. "I'm not going anywhere," JD replied, his voice steady, though the anger was simmering just beneath the surface. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can't just make me leave." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward. For a moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. People glanced up, but only for a split second before quickly looking away again, as if the situation was too volatile for them to even witness. JD felt the weight of their silence pressing down on him, but he refused to back off. He was done being pushed around. "What's going on here?" JD asked, his tone colder now. "Why is everyone acting like I'm some kind of threat?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, as though to gauge the room's reaction. When he turned back to JD, his face was set in stone, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "You don't get it, do you?" the man said finally. His voice had dropped to a near whisper, but the words were sharp, each one cutting through the heavy air. "This town doesn't want you here. They never did. You think because you've got money and a title that you can just waltz in and change everything. You're not welcome." JD's jaw tightened. He had heard enough of this. "I'm here for dinner. That's all. I'm not trying to change anyone's life or disrupt anything." The man shook his head, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think you're just another politician. That's the problem. You don't understand how deep this goes. It's not about you personally, JD. It's about everything you represent, everything people like you stand for. The people in this town, they want things to stay the way they've always been." JD paused, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this really about him? Or was it something deeper? He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but there was something in the man's eyes that made him pause. Fear. It was there, just for a second, before the man masked it again. JD took a step closer, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. "What is it that they're so afraid of? Why is everyone so scared of change?" For a moment, The man didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at JD like he was trying to decide how much to reveal. The tension in the room thickened, and JD couldn't help but notice that even the waitress, who had been silently watching the exchange, now stood frozen in place. The entire diner had gone silent, the buzz of conversation that had once filled the room now gone. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "People here, they don't trust outsiders. They've been here their whole lives, and they don't want to see it all fall apart because of someone like you, someone who doesn't understand what it means to be a part of this community." JD's mind raced. This wasn't just about a simple disagreement. It was a reflection of something much larger, something JD had underestimated. There was fear, yes, but it was fear of change, fear of the unknown. "And what does that mean for me?" JD asked, his voice quieter now. He wasn't backing down, but there was a note of exhaustion in his words. "Am I supposed to just leave?" The man's lips twisted into something that could almost be considered a smile, but it wasn't kind. "Maybe you should, before things get worse." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, and JD knew the conversation was over, but he wasn't ready to leave just yet. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let fear dictate the narrative. Not now, not when he was so close to the truth. As JD turned to leave, he shot one last look at the man. "I'm not going anywhere. You'll see that soon enough." And with that, he stepped out of the diner, leaving behind the silence, the tension, and the fear. But JD knew this wasn't over. Whatever had been set in motion that night would change everything, whether the people in Springfield liked it or not. The tension in Owen's diner hung in the air like an invisible fog. JD stood in the center of the room, every eye on him. And though he could feel the weight of the stairs, there was something else, something deeper in the atmosphere. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The quiet murmurs had returned, low and unsettling, but JD couldn't ignore the growing sense that he was at the epicenter of something far bigger than he had anticipated. The man who had warned him earlier had retreated back to his seat, his expression unreadable, but JD could still feel his eyes on him, watching every move, every decision. It was clear now that whatever had been happening here long before JD's arrival wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. JD glanced at the hostess, who still stood behind the counter, her posture rigid. She was no longer hiding the discomfort that had clouded her earlier. Now, there was a sense of resolve in her eyes, as if she had made her peace with whatever was about to unfold. But it wasn't just her. Every person in the diner seemed to share the same quiet determination. It was almost as if they were all waiting for something, a sign, a moment, or perhaps a decision that JD had yet to make. A bell rang from the kitchen, followed by the soft shuffle of feet. The swinging door opened, and out came the cook, a burly man with a thick mustache and an apron that seemed to have absorbed decades of grease. His eyes scanned the room quickly, a slight frown creasing his forehead as he caught sight of JD standing by the door. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cook paused, looking from JD to the man who had spoken earlier, then to the hostess, before he finally spoke in a voice that was surprisingly calm considering the weight of the silence. "You need to leave, son," the cook said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This place isn't for people like you." JD's mind raced. People like you. The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time that evening, he felt a pang of unease. Was this a personal attack? Was this about his reputation, his political stance, or was it something more? Something buried deep within the history of this town. "I'm not leaving," JD said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I'm not sure what this is about, but I'm not backing down." The cook didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a long look with the hostess, whose face had gone pale. JD could see the tension between them, a flicker of something unspoken passing between the two, but neither of them said a word. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement between them, a silent understanding that JD was missing, and no matter how hard he tried to read between the lines, he couldn't crack it. JD, the man who had warned him earlier, said, his voice low but cutting through the thick silence like a knife. You don't understand. It's not just about you. It's about everything. About all the things you're too blind to see. You think you can just walk in here, in this town, and start stirring the pot like you always do. You're not just a politician to these people. You're something else, something they don't want. They don't want change, JD. Not here. Not in their world. You're not welcome. The words stung more than JD expected. He had faced opposition before, faced disdain from people who didn't share his vision. But this was different. This felt personal. It was more than just a disagreement. It was as if he had unknowingly become a symbol of everything this town had been trying to protect, trying to preserve. A sense of dread settled over him, but JD was no stranger to adversity. He had faced the harshest critics, the most venomous attacks, and he had always come out on top. But this situation, this odd tension, the way the town seemed to be breathing in unison, refusing to acknowledge his presence, it wasn't just a political battle. It was something more primal, something deep-rooted in the very fabric of the town. I'm not going anywhere, JD repeated, though this time his voice was tinged with a sense of resolve he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure why, but the more they tried to push him out, the more he felt the need to stay. Something was hidden here, something important. And JD wasn't the type of person to walk away when there was a mystery to be solved. The cook's frown deepened, and he took a step closer, his shadow falling across JD's path. You don't get it, the cook muttered, his eyes narrowing. You think you're just a visitor here, that this is just another stop in your little journey. But this town, JD, it's not what you think. It's not what you see on the surface. JD swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave, but the words from the man, the silence from the others, and the feeling that something bigger was at stake kept him rooted to the spot. Then tell me what it is, JD demanded, his voice now a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Tell me what this town really is. Tell me what you're hiding. For a brief moment, the cook didn't respond. He merely stared at JD, as though measuring him, weighing the truth of his words. The tension was unbearable, and JD was sure he could hear his pulse racing in his ears. The cook glanced over at the hostess, then back at JD, his face a mask of frustration. You'll understand soon enough, but you won't like what you find. And with that, he turned and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving JD standing there, more uncertain than ever. What had he walked into? And more importantly, why did it feel like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover the truth? The diner was quiet once again, but the air was thick with anticipation. JD wasn't sure what was coming next, but he had a feeling that this wasn't just about a meal anymore. This was about something far darker, something that went deeper than he ever imagined. And he was about to uncover it. The diner was still, but the weight of unspoken words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. JD stood frozen in place, his mind racing. What had he stumbled upon in this small town? Every face in the room, every movement, every glance seemed like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. The warning from the cook echoed in his mind. You won't like what you find. For a moment, JD considered leaving, walking out the door, and continuing on with his life. But something inside him wouldn't allow it. He couldn't just let it go. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't a simple case of unwelcoming locals. This was something much darker, something buried deep in the fabric of Springfield. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as they settled on the man who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had warned him in a voice low enough to be barely a whisper. The man was sitting at the counter, his posture stiff, eyes forward, but JD could feel the tension radiating off him. It wasn't just the other diners that were silent, it was the whole town, as though they had all agreed, consciously or not, to keep whatever was hidden locked away. JD approached the counter, the creak of his boots on the wooden floor louder than usual in the silence. He didn't know what he expected. Perhaps some kind of revelation, a confession, or even a hint at what he had walked into. But the man didn't look at him when he spoke. He kept his gaze on the counter, the edge of his coffee cup between his hands. "You need to stop asking questions," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're digging into something you won't understand." JD leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued. "What is it you're hiding?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "Why is everyone so scared? What's going on here?" The man hesitated for a long moment, as though wrestling with the decision to reveal something that had been kept secret for far too long. Finally, he sighed, setting his coffee cup down with a soft clink. His eyes met JG's, and for the first time that night, they weren't filled with disdain or hostility. Instead, there was something else, something that bordered on pity. "You wouldn't believe it if I told you," the man said, his voice hoarse. "It's not just about you, JD. It's about everything that's been happening here for generations. You're just the next person to stumble onto it. But the truth—" He paused, glancing around the diner before leaning closer to JG. "The truth is this. Springfield isn't what you think. This town, this diner, the people, you don't know who they really are." JD felt a chill crawl up his spine. This diner, the people? What was this man trying to say? JD had heard rumors about towns with dark histories, about secrets buried so deep that they were passed down like family heirlooms, never spoken of, never questioned. But he hadn't imagined that he'd be standing in the middle of such a place. "I'm listening," JD said quietly, his voice steady, but his heart pounding in his chest. "Tell me what this is really about." The man looked around again, his eyes darting from the hostess to the cook, then back to JD, before lowering his voice to a near whisper. "They made a pact," he said, his words careful, as if saying them out loud might make them real. "A long time ago, when this town was founded, they made a deal with someone, and in exchange for peace, prosperity, and safety, they agreed to keep the town's darkest secrets hidden. For generations, they've been protecting it, protecting themselves. Anyone who comes too close to the truth, they're silenced." JD's mind spun as the man's words sunk in. A pact, a deal. What kind of deal could a town make that would cause this level of secrecy, this kind of fear? It was the kind of thing JD had only read about in stories, tales of ancient promises, of towns that had been built on blood and lies. But this wasn't a story. This was real. "I don't understand," JD said, his voice tight. "What are they protecting? What are they hiding?" The man's eyes flicked nervously to the kitchen door, and JD could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't just nervous anymore. He was scared. "It's not just a thing," the man replied, his voice barely audible. "It's of them. Something ancient. Something that shouldn't be here, but it's bound to this place, and so is everyone who lives here. They don't leave. They can't." JD felt a knot form in his stomach. What was this? What was this thing that had been hiding in the shadows for generations? And why were they all so terrified to speak about it? "Are you telling me that this town is stuck in some kind of curse?" JD asked, his voice incredulous. He couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. All the secrecy, the fear, the strange way the townspeople had acted when he arrived. It was all falling into place. The man nodded slowly, his face pale. "It's not just a curse, JG. It's a bond. They're bound to it. And now you are too. That's why you need to leave. It's not just about you getting involved in politics. It's about you getting involved in something that could end up destroying everything you've worked for. Something you can't walk away from once you've seen it." JD felt a chill wash over him. The weight of the man's words settled on him like a heavy cloak. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had stumbled into a legacy, a town with a secret that could ruin everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in. "You're not safe here, G," the man warned. "None of us are." Suddenly, JD wasn't so sure he wanted to uncover the truth. Maybe some secrets were better left buried, after all.